You know rum, right? Rum comes from the sugarcane plant. Sugarcane plant comes from what, the Caribbean? No. It comes from Indonesia. But that's probably not important. Really, what's important is after the sugarcane plant finds its way across Asia, across Africa, it gets to the Caribbean, and that's where we associate sugarcane and its byproduct, rum. Now, how did it get there? Well, just for the record, Christopher Columbus. Yeah, it's his second voyage. He stops in the Canary Islands, picks up sugarcane, we think actually from his father-in-law, who worked there in the Canary Islands, on his way to the Caribbean, drops it in the Caribbean islands where it finds fertile soil, both literally and figuratively. And well, yes, now today we think of sugarcane in the Caribbean and we think of it as its byproduct, rum, as something of the Caribbean. But let's be clear about it. Rum can be made anywhere at all. Yeah, it's made in the Caribbean. Yeah, we associate it with the Caribbean because here's what happens. If you take sugarcane and you grind it up, if you will, if you squeeze it out, and then you centrifuge that stuff, you're going to get sugar, which is what you're trying to get out of the sugarcane plant, right? But you're going to have leftovers in the middle of the centrifuge called molasses. Now, you can only spread so much molasses on your pancakes and toast before somebody went, let's make some rum out of this, okay? I mean, we're talking about Spanish conquistadors. They didn't really have beer. They really couldn't get the wine thing to happen in the New World. They needed a drink desperately. So you ferment molasses into some kind of rudimentary beer, and then you distill that, and you end up with rum. I don't care if you call it rum or rum with an H like the French do, or cachaça like they do in Brazil, but it's a kind of rum. Iraq, they call it all the way over in Asia, but it's basically anytime you make a distillate from this sugarcane juice that you fermented into a kind of beer or molasses, the leftovers of making sugar out of sugarcane, you're going to call that stuff rum. Now, rum comes from these different islands, and well, frankly, we associate styles of rum with certain islands. Well, let's go back in time just a little bit. Let's look at Columbus's voyage and the people who came after him. So often they were, got to talk about this story, slave traders, all right? And coming from Africa with human beings, dropping them in the Americas, they would pick up raw goods to go back with, because you're trying to make this nice loop out of the thing and do a little business all the way around. Well, the raw goods you pick up in pre-colonial America or colonial America, or frankly, the United States early in its days, is you pick up tobacco, you pick up cotton, and you pick up sugarcane. Now, sugarcane, well, it's not exactly the most efficient way to move sugar back to Europe. So what happens in reality, or at least in practice? People bounce along the eastern seaboard, do a little business, pick up some passengers, drop them off, what have you. But at some point, you head back to Europe, and you don't take the sugarcane plant with you. What you do is you drop it in its last port of call in New England, and those New England sugar refiners, they give you sugar in exchange for the sugar cane. Now, there's a lot of leftover molasses, and again, people make rum out of that stuff. And 100, 200, 300 years ago, if you asked for rum, you were most likely, if you were living in Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. or New York or New Amsterdam or wherever you were most likely to end up with a rum that came from New England. Pretty much straight out of the still. Not pretty stuff. Pretty raw and fiery and Kill Devil and Rum Bullion and Rum Bustion and all those nasty names they used for this stuff. Kind of a pirate juice. Now, were they not making rum down in the Caribbean islands? Yeah, they were making pirate juice down there too. But there was a handful of places that made really good rum. Now, Barbados would have to be included amongst those. Why would we talk about Barbados as making really good rum? Barbados, in a lot of the 17th and all the 18th century, was a major factory for sugar. That meant it was a major place that used slaves. It's a very ugly story, but because there were so many slaves there, tens of thousands of them, on this little tiny island making a whole bunch of sugar, there's a lot of molasses left over. For a while they dumped it into the ocean, but eventually they got smart, they made rum out of it, and the rum that was coming, let's say, from New England was pretty raw and fiery, but the rum coming from the islands, particularly from Barbados, because they made so much of this stuff, is in barrel for a while, maybe a year, maybe 2 years. What happens when you stick that stuff in barrel for a while? It smooths out. You pick up caramel, you pick up molasses notes, even butterscotch, honey, things like that. Things that are soft and smooth and, well, sound sweet to the ear at least, and certainly a lot better than stuff coming straight out of those distilleries in New England. So when George Washington, at his inauguration, asked for a barrel of Bajan rum, he ends up with a barrel of Barbados rum, and he's really good with that, because that's the good stuff back then. Now, today we associate Barbados and places like the Virgin Islands as an area that gives us these soft, smooth, rich rums, but not fiery rums at all. Not really the pirate juice thing so much. Other islands like, say, Haiti, and certainly the French islands, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Marie-Galante, we associate a different style of rum with those places. Why? Because they didn't really ever make their rums from molasses. Why? Because in France they had sugar beet factories. They were making their own sugar. They didn't need to buy sugar from their islands in the Caribbean. So there was really no leftover molasses from sugar production. You just squeezed the plant, used the juice, distilled that stuff after it fermented into a rudimentary kind of beer, and you ended up with a style of rum today we call rum agricole. It's frankly really closely affiliated with cachaça in that it uses the sugarcane juice and in that it has the same kinds of flavors. What are those flavors? Herbal, sort of floral, sort of funky, maybe a little bit wild. But you want wild? No, the style that we associate with funky and wild is Jamaica, that island style, if you will. Dark and rich and funky and wild and weird and sometimes chocolatey, sometimes molasses. And that style is associated with Jamaica not because that's the dominant style they make. Frankly, the most popular rum on the island of Jamaica is a thing called Wray and Nephew. It's a white rum. It's 124 proof, so it packs a wallop, but you get the idea. They make different styles of rum on different islands, not because they have to, because the island soil makes them do this or something, but because that's the way they make the rum. And so Jamaica's style of rum is a 19th century style of rum. It's a snapshot, if you will, of what people saw they could do with rum during the 19th century. They could make it a little funkier, a little wilder, and sometimes they put flavorings in it, sometimes they put spices in it, and that's just to soften the darn thing. But that's not the only style. In fact, that's not the dominant style of rum today, is it? Today we think of Puerto Rican rum, or frankly its predecessor, Cuban rum, a style of rum that's softer, milder, frankly that's the result of continuous stills because Puerto Rico, Cuba became dominant in the 20th century in sugar production when continuous stills were now the norm. So with continuous stills, what I can distill to a higher proof. What does that mean? It means I can remove more congeners, more flavors, more aromas, and I end up with a softer, milder, sleeker style of rum. In addition, Bacardi at the end of the 19th century also figured out that he could stick it in a barrel for a while and age it, smooth it out a little bit that way, and then put it through charcoal filtration, which was the hot thing going on with vodka at the time, and make it even softer and smoother. So that very mild style of rum we often associate with Cuba, Puerto Rico, maybe certainly some other places as well. There's no question that styles, as I say, are not limited to certain islands, but they're associated with certain islands. So there's this French tradition of sugarcane juice, a little more herbal, a little more floral, a little wilder. There's a Spanish tradition of aged and smooth and rich. There's this British tradition. Indeed, we should talk about that. We should certainly mention the idea that the British Navy, you gotta like this. Once upon a time, the British Navy, any Navy man had to have rum every single day. Bummer, I know, twisting arms, crazy. But up until 1960s, believe it or not, they still had to have rum every day because you'd have with a little lime, which is going to prevent scurvy. You might have sometimes a little tonic in some places, which is going to prevent malaria, but certainly rum is just going to prevent lethargy, bad attitude. It's just a good idea. So the British tradition with rum, the British Navy tradition with rum is old and venerated. Today, all those styles are showing up in the marketplace. Today, all those styles are important to you. Cachaça, really important. I mean, I know 10 years ago, hardly anybody had even thought about it. Caipirinhas were kind of showing up, and occasionally a bartender got off their rear end long enough to try to find a single bottle of cachaça to make this stuff. Today, cachaça is huge. It ought to be. It's the third largest spirit category in the world, but I digress. We still only see a handful of styles of cachaça. It's basically a rum. It's made from sugarcane juice, and then kind of the weird part about cachaça is the barrels it's aged in are rarely ever oak. It's cedar, it's cherry, it's jiquitapa, it's umburana, it's all sorts of weird stuff. Reju, weird woods you haven't heard of before. Sometimes they add a little pink color from that wood. It gives it a slightly pink color, gives it a floral, weird, spicy, exotic nose, which does some pretty cool things in certain cocktails. And that's where we're at today. We've got a lot of cocktails we can make from these various kinds of rums. We're seeing premium aged rums that are really exciting. We're seeing premium white rums that are really exciting. And yeah, flavored rums are huge as a category. It's big stuff. And yeah, I'll admit that some of those flavored rums are really just a step away from flavored vodka. They pretty much look the same in the back bar. But let's be real about this. Flavored rum is a very old category. It's the earliest part of this tradition. Going back 200 and 300 years ago, they were making pirate juice. They knew that, so they put in flavorings, spices, things like that to make it softer and milder. So there's this long tradition. And the cool thing about rum and its way into cocktails is, unlike most other spirit categories, you can take a little bit of this rum, a little bit of that rum, different styles of rums, blend them together, and you end up with very, very cool cocktails.